West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. Netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théères, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est long, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte.
Is joining us now, Chief Washington Correspondent for The New Yorker, Jane Mayer, with some breaking news about Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. Jane, what do you have?
He told me that he's not seeking re-election and his term ends on December 31st. So the person who is leading the most major, one of two cases, but the biggest case, investigating Donald Trump, is going to not likely preside over any trial if there is one. It also comes at a time when the investigation seems to really be heating up in his hands, but it means that whoever is going to take over is not yet known.
Jane, the AP's Jonathan Lemire is with us and has a question. Jonathan.
Well, Jane, talk to us, if you will, about the continuation. Like, what will that mean? I mean, there's a lot of course, national interest in the potential of these investigations into former President Trump, into his business, the Trump Organization. If there's a change of leadership at the top, what's the trickle-down effect? Will this delay things, slow things down? Will the team of actual investigators who are doing the work each and every day, will they be impacted about this? Just walk us through what the next steps might be.
Well, I mean, in fact, it seems that Vance has brought in people who will help with continuity. He's now brought in a very highly respected lawyer in New York, Mark Pomerantz, to he's been made a special assistant DA. And he's someone who's had experience prosecuting mob cases and other cases, and is also a very highly skilled white-collar defense lawyer with a big law firm in New York. And so he will probably stay on, people think. Vance has also brought in an extremely accomplished forensic accounting firm that's capable of crunching vast amounts of financial information, like the tax returns that have now been given over to Vance's office. They recently received, the Supreme Court upheld their subpoena and said that they could have all of these records that Trump has been hiding all of these years. So the personnel is kind of in place for continuity. I think it puts on some pressure to wrap up the investigation maybe as quickly as they can. I think they think that Vance will be the one who will decide whether there will be charges brought against Trump, which means they expect that to happen certainly by the end of this year.
Tom Winter, there's so much swirling around President Trump, it can be hard to remember what exactly we're talking about here. This started for the Manhattan DA's office in 2018 with the alleged hush money payment to Stormy Daniels through Michael Cohen and the rest of it, but obviously has expanded to something much bigger than that since. So what all are exactly they looking into at this point?
Well, as best we can figure out, and what we've done is try to be able to follow the subpoenas in this case. To your point, Willie, it has expanded beyond those hush money payments. It has expanded beyond Manhattan, and it's looking at the broader parts of the Trump empire, coast to coast. And so this is a investigation that's looking at his properties. We're talking about his Seven Springs properties. There's some indications that they're looking into real estate deals in Chicago. So it has expanded, and really the core of this investigation, and you can talk about different properties and different tentacles of it, but really the core of this investigation is whether or not there was insurance fraud, tax fraud, or bank fraud here. What were the representations that the Trump organization and the president made to banks at the same time he was filing his taxes? Do those things match up? Were there discrepancies? If so, was it intentional? Was it an intentional way to mislead banks to lend him money or to skirt paying taxes? Those are the issues that are being looked at here, and those are the concerns. And, whenever somebody's appointed like a Mark Pomerantz, I don't just pay attention to what their background was as a prosecutor. I look at what they did as a defense attorney. And when you look at his background in financial crime, security fraud, you have somebody that can look at evidence not just as a prosecutor of, okay, how can I build my case? What are the building blocks? I look at that person's experience of how can they attack that evidence? And he's going to know how this will be looked at by the president's attorneys if there are charges. He's going to know how other people might look at those particular pieces of evidence or witness testimony. So Mark Pomerantz's hiring here, I think, is a real coup and speaks to the non-political nature of this investigation.
It is Friday, the 12th of March of 2021, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner the English Bulldog is our snoozing sous chef, and our daily special is Blue Moon Spirits Fridays, because we are all Nighthawks in the Diner of Life. Well, so much news coming into the weekend. It's not the kind of news that would cause us consternation, sleeplessness, a bit of fidgeting, nervousness. Not that kind of news that we have been experiencing for the last 4 years. Fortunately now, after, 51 days? The news is a bit, different. We'll just say it's different. It has a different effect upon our physiology. And in that, I thank our 81 million American citizens who made sure that the news on the weekend changes ever so slightly. Thank you. Well, I'm thanking myself too, because I'm part of that 81 mil. So, what do we have going on? Well, we have the American Rescue Plan, and it's going to be signed and put into effect, and it looks like people are going to start getting their checks this weekend, which is tomorrow. Now that's quick. All sorts of attention has been paid to the enormity of the American Rescue Plan and its historic nature, and it's right up there with FDR. So it made me wonder, when we look historically back on what FDR did, we look at it as the halcyon days of what America can do. But when I see the little titters there and titters here and titters everywhere, it makes me realize, when FDR rolled out his plan, there was a lot of people who really hated it. Even people who were going to benefit, who needed it, because, of who the players are, who were involved. Personality even mattered then, and it matters apparently a lot more now. So it is kind of disconcerting when I hear people calling it a giveaway. It's just giving money to people who don't want to work. What? Do you realize that they couldn't work? There was no work to go to? I don't know. Some people live in their little bubbles and they don't think that anybody else in the world exists. So when we have over 500,000 people dead in a year, they can pretend, I don't know anybody like that. I've heard of them. But all the numbers are inflated. It's just a flu. 500,000 people don't die of the flu like this. It's the big lie. still, I don't know, is working. Because it doesn't become the big lie and get embedded into the pituitary, I guess. I don't know. What part of the lizard brain does it exist in that causes the little twitching and the jerking and the snapping of the jaws? Whatever it is, it's been tickled, or I might even say it's more than tickled. It's Friday. We'll get it together here somehow. So, out here in Southern Oregon, I will say that there are a few of the Republican types who might be coming around. So I have been hearing suggestions that we don't mock the Republicans who have voted for Trump and who marched in lockstep with him, who smiled and looked upon him with gleaming eyes. A bunch of cult members. We're not supposed to insult the cult members. Wait a second. Hasn't anybody ever heard of tough love? That's all I ever heard about, tough love. We got to have an intervention and get these kids out of this cult. And we're going to have to use tough love. But now that tough love and interventions are being considered for these family members and people that we know, it's a terrible practice. So terrible. We can't mock them. We can't insult them. We can't basically get in their faces and tell them to shut the F up and sit the F down. Because it will cause them to be even more entrenched in their beliefs because they're so stubborn. So what? I'm tired of it. I'm tired of coddling these people. They're a bunch of cowards. They project every weakness they have onto other people. Every crime they've committed, they project upon other people. I think to deflect from the dissonance that occurs because they know that they've done wrong. So if they can say, well, that other person's doing wrong too, so therefore my wrong isn't as wrong. Do we just say on our side, oh, well, that explains it all. We just have to let it be. Give them an inch and they're going to take 10 miles. And then they're going to take another 10 miles. The next thing you know, there's no more miles left. And 50 years goes on and nothing changes. We're back to using the N-word. Can't code it anymore. Lee Atwater must be turning in his grave. Or maybe he's happy. Well, we don't have to use these code words anymore. We can just use the N-word. Wow, everything comes around in a circle if you wait long enough. I'm sorry. I am impatient with this crew. They have been given enough patience. They've been given enough leeway. They've been given enough chances to atone for their sins. And yet not once have they ever admitted their sins. What do we do about it? Or are we going to be like the terrible meanies coming after them like they say we are? Oh, they're so evil. I love how I got attacked by some royal apologists because apparently Prince William the White is really the sound of or the voice of reason, and that terrible Meghan, she just wanted to tear that family apart. Well, you know what? I think inbreeding and having that Habsburg chin and nose might have a lot more to do with destroying the royal lineage than anything Meghan Markle's comments on racism, not just within the royals, but within Brit society. I think that's why she's hated. The worst thing that you can call a racist is calling them a racist. They'll call you a racist. Oh, yeah, Meghan was a racist. So was Harry. Harry's a racist. They're the racists. All right. As I've mentioned before, Gandhi says that's throwing salt on the wounds. Yeah, you'll get that one after a while. I bet you will. Okay. Well, I said we have a lot of news coming up, and it's going to be with us this whole weekend. And what is on the rest of the menu here in the Bistro Cafe part of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy? Well, some breaking news. Cyrus Vance is going to quit. well, on December 31st. And there was some questioning about whether just as this investigation is heating up into Trump, Cyrus Vance is stepping down. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I actually don't think the investigation is going to wind down. Of course, Vance is not going to quit until the 31st, that's when his term is up. And he's not running for re-election. That's how I should really put it. He's not quitting. He's just not running for re-election. But he's going to be in the office until then. And it may be that, as was speculated in the clip, that charges will be brought before he leaves office. But I also think that the team that's been assembled, you know how these line prosecutors work. It doesn't matter who the political head is. They keep doing their jobs. And it looks like Donald Trump is in deep trouble. Trying to get rid of the governor, and he's probably going to be successful in that. And probably for good reason. But I don't think they're going to get an acting governor who they want. We also have to remind ourselves that just because someone in New York calls themselves a Democrat doesn't mean that they're a Democrat. It's the only way you can win in New York. Because if you said you're a Republican, well, everybody knows what Republicans are. They're Nazis. No one's going to call themselves a Nazi and run in New York. Please. But everything that I've heard is that the lieutenant governor is a reasonable person and a Democrat, not a Nazi. Thank goodness. So even with replacing the governor, hoping for a pardon, by the way, and getting rid of Cyrus Vance, because Cyrus Vance already dropped that investigation once, twice, until the heat got too much, and now he's leaving. And it could be for any number of reasons. Donald Trump might have something to do with it, because we know how Donald Trump works. He's a mobster. He puts pressure on people. Horses' heads at the foot of a bed? I wouldn't put it above him one whit. On the rest of the menu, in the wake of the Breonna Taylor protests, the innocent black woman shot dead in her own apartment by a no-knock warrant where they came into the wrong apartment. The Kentucky Senate voted to make it a crime to taunt the police. Well, I don't think that's going to... Well, on the other hand, I was just going to say that's not going to pass constitutional muster. And then I was reminded who is sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States. And I'm thinking, well, they're making the rules about what is constitutional muster now. So I guess maybe it's going to be against the law to taunt the police after they killed an innocent woman. A contempt hearing in Phoenix is sought for Joe Arpaio's successor for pretty much the same thing Arpaio was held in contempt for as well. Interesting. And several groups have sued Kern County, California, after the Board of Supervisors approved a plan to fast-track thousands of new oil wells ahead of Joe Biden's EPA requirements. Kern County? I think they're run by Nazis. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where the Ivory Coast mourned the death of Prime Minister Hamed Bakayoko, the second premier to die in office in less than 8 months. It's not as conspiratorial as it sounds. He did die of cancer, unfortunately. And Brazil's lower house approved a bill allowing the renewal of pandemic aid to poor families. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. At the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com, to the right of the page is the chat room link monitored by Kelly Lincoln. Thank you, Kelly. To the left of that chat room link near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com, you will then hopefully notice the link to our Patreon page. And that is there because, well, we make this, at least during this show and in treaty, 5 days a week, for funds to help us pay our bills. Because even though, you know what, we've been broadcasting this resistance radio broadcasting for 10 years, 24/7, 365. We haven't missed a day. And even when I've been having surgeries and stuff, we still kept it going. Because we have a crack team and we have a civic duty to continue what this is. And your generosity has allowed us to fulfill our civic duty. 10 years this year. Yesterday was the official launch of Netroots Radio in 2011. Isn't that something? And so we marked that day. And 10 years is quite a while. Now, we're not a media empire. It would have been nice, but we would not lessen our resolve to what democracy is just for, getting some money. And who's going to throw money at liberal causes that are really resisting the prevailing powers that be that are very deep-pocketed? They're not going to throw money at us, please. So what do we have left? Well, I guess you would say the partisan resistance, which is you and me and all the rest of us. If you could afford an espresso-type coffee drink, as others have, and send those funds to us once a month, we stretch those dollars, we pay our bills, fly under the radar, and continue resisting as the founders originally intended, so many years ago. Thank you truly for your generosity, and happy birthday to us. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, go to @NetrootsRadio. Tom takes care of that. Thanks, Tom. I, of course, take care of me. And who am I? I am @JusticePutnam on Twitter. And I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Codes about 10 minutes before showtime and then get that linked up on Twitter. So follow me on Twitter. You'll get the show notes and links diary. I also post it on other social media platforms, and you know which ones they are. You can follow the show on Twitter @CookbookWest. And please, if you would, pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, and wherever podcasts can be found. Not only West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, but my music show on Sundays, the Justice Department Music Sans Frontières. You can pick that up. Also, Kelly Lincoln shows. You can pick those up as well. And every now and then, Tom has something out. Okay, so check out our podcasts on Spreaker and all those others as well. This first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is out of the Associated Press, written by Piper Hudspeth Blackburn. It could become a crime to taunt a police officer in Kentucky under a bill that passed the state Senate yesterday, Thursday. The measure was filed months after Louisville, the state's largest city, became the site of huge protests in the wake of the police killing of Breonna Taylor. Now, let's remember, Breonna Taylor was just merely a black woman in her home, in her bedclothes, in the middle of the night when the cops came bursting through and shot her dead in the hallway right outside her bedroom. And people were rightfully upset about that. But now it's a crime to call out a police officer in public for killing an innocent black woman. Just don't call it systemic racism. There's no such thing as systemic racism in America, and this is certainly not an example of it. Ask Tucker. Under the legislation, anyone who accosts, insults, taunts, or challenges a law officer with offensive or derisive words or by gestures, like saying, fuck you, and flipping them off, First Amendment rights, or other physical contact that would have a direct tendency to provoke a violent response. Wait a second. It doesn't take much to provoke a violent response from a cop. Look at him halfway side-eyes. Or is it side-eyed? Yeah, side-eyed. Look at them half side-eyed, and they're going to beat the crap out of you. I'm serious. When they rub your face into the pavement while cuffing you, that's obstructing a police officer. When they beat the crap out of you, shot in the back, that's called resisting arrest. Just be clear about how that works. I mean, there was a 12-year-old kid in Santa Rosa, California, carrying an airsoft gun playing in a park, and a cop shot him dead in the back. Why? Because the cop feared for his life, and his actions, the kid playing in the park, provoked a violent reaction, and the cop got off. We all saw the kid in the park in the wintertime. Yeah, we know. Cops drove right up on him. What was he doing? He was playing cops and robbers all by himself in a park. 12-year-old kid. Another 12-year-old kid, huh? Shot dead because his actions provoked a violent response. It doesn't take much to provoke a violent response from a cop. So I guess what that means is that the cops now have impunity to kill anybody, and you know it's going to be black people and their fellow travelers. The proposal also increases penalties for rioting. For instance, those charged with rioting would be required to be held for a minimum of 48 hours. Another provision would criminalize aiming a light, a laser pointer, an activated horn, or other noise-making device toward the head of a first responder. Oh, you know, when they bring out all their military gear and that big old sound bomb cannon that they have. But you might have one of those little bullhorns. You'll be charged with rioting. State Senator Danny Carroll, a repug, which is just a nice way of calling him a Nazi, who sponsored the bill, said he filed the proposal in response to last summer's Louisville protests against police brutality and racial injustice. And why were there demonstrations, Mr. Nazi? Taylor, a black woman, was shot in her Louisville home multiple times by police during a botched drug raid. A grand jury indicted one officer on wanton endangerment charges in September for the shooting into a white neighbor's apartment, but no officers have ever been charged in connection with her death. And now if you bring that up to the cops in Kentucky, you will be charged as a rioter, and you might end up dead. Jacques Villieu of the AP brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Blue Moon Spirits Fridays. Paul Penzone took office 4 years ago as Metro Phoenix's new sheriff, promising to turn the page on the problems created by his headline-grabbing predecessor, Joe Arpaio. Ousted in part after he was found in contempt of court for disobeying a judge's order in a racial profiling case. Now, Penzone faces calls for a contempt hearing in the same racial profiling lawsuit, this time for not complying with a court-ordered overhaul of his agency's much criticized internal affairs operation, which has a backlog of 2,000 cases. Under Penzone's leadership, he's caused them to take, on average, each of those 2,000 cases takes 500 days to complete. He's slowing down the process purposefully. Civil rights lawyers and the U.S. Department of Justice asked a judge in a court filing to hold a contempt hearing for Penzone, arguing he is out of compliance with a requirement that internal investigations be completed within 60 to 85 days. Not like the better part of 2 years. Please. The attorneys argue that the length of the investigations has resulted in lost evidence that makes it more likely that officer misconduct won't be confronted. The lawyers also said a community advisory board set up to help improve trust in the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office has said that it's questionable whether it should encourage people to file complaints when the process is so flawed. The lawyer said failing to investigate internal complaints on a timely basis harms the class of Hispanics covered by the profiling lawsuit because officers can continue interacting with them while the investigations are pending. Interacting is a nice way of saying they are being intimidated. It's unclear what sort of penalties Penzone could face if the court agreed to hold a hearing and finds him in civil contempt. Generally, the punishments for civil contempt are fines, though on rare occasions, jail time is given to those who refuse a judge's order to provide information or take action. During his last year as sheriff in 2016, Arpaio was found in civil contempt for ignoring a 2011 court order to stop his traffic patrols that were targeting immigrants. After Arpaio was ousted by the Democratic Penzone in an election, Arpaio was found guilty of criminal contempt for disobeying the order. He was spared a possible jail sentence for the misdemeanor conviction, thanks to a 2017 pardon by then-President Donald Trump. Associated Press staff bring us this final offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Environmental and community groups have sued a California county after the prime oil drilling region approved a plan to fast-track thousands of new wells in a state that's positioned itself as a leader in combating climate change. The Kern County Board of Supervisors approved a revised ordinance that could lead to approval of more than 40,000 new oil and gas wells over roughly 15 years. The Sierra Club and other groups asked the court to order county leaders to set aside the ordinance and bar them from approving any drilling permits. The county, about 100 miles north of Los Angeles, did not immediately reply to an email seeking comment on the lawsuit because they know they're in deep doo-doo now. The state appeals court ruled last year that a 2015 Kern County ordinance violated the California Environmental Quality Act by not fully evaluating or disclosing environmental damage that could occur from drilling. New drilling permits were not issued while the county returned to the drawing board. The revised ordinance would allow the county to use a blanket environmental impact report when considering as many as 2,700 new wells. Wow, they just get it written by Alec, apply it to everyone. Kern County is the state's leading fossil fuel producer and also a major agricultural area. Yeah, how about a little bit of oil with your grapes? It accounts for about 80% of all oil and gas production in California, with about 1 in 7 workers in the county of 900,000 having a job tied to the oil industry. Well, heck, the high school athletic mascot is called the Oilers. Supervisors argued that the fossil fuel industry provides good jobs, and the production under local requirements would be more environmentally sound than bringing foreign oil into the nation's most populated state by truck, ship, or pipeline. The lawsuit notes that Kern County already has some of the most polluted air in the U.S. It contends that the revised ordinance was based on unrealistic assumptions about pollution and failed to evaluate all the health risks. Wow, I'm shocked. Okay, that brings us to our break, and when we get back from that break, you do know we'll go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. This week, 21st Century Grapes of Wrath. While the story in the adapted screenplay Nomadland isn't similar to the Steinbeck novel or John Ford film of last century, one can't help but note certain parallels. Both are set in the American heartland, and the action in both stems from massive economic displacement, which causes the characters to question their place in a remote and evolving system. Nomadland follows Fern, a victim of the Great Recession. In 2011, the real-life town of Empire, Nevada was abandoned, its zip code deleted, when the U.S. gypsum plant there closed due to a lack of demand for sheetrock after the construction industry collapse. Following the death of her husband and with few prospects, she sells her possessions and hits the road in search of work, which very much defines her self-worth. She finds gigs okay, it's the gig economy, right? At an Amazon fulfillment center, in kitchens and agriculture, as well as fellowship on the road amongst the similarly situated. The film is very much a window into the world of, as Fern emphatically notes, the houseless, not the homeless. Besides one overtly political monologue at a nomad encampment, these folks' desperation is left unstated, leaving one to wonder how in America. In the movie's second half, though, it becomes clear that, unlike some of Fern's compatriots, she has choices, and it's here that the documentary lean gives way to a more conventional dramatic narrative. Frances McDormand becomes Fern for director Chloe Zhao. Most of the other characters are real-life nomads, used perfectly in the spectacularly shot gem. In Grapes of Wrath, there were messianic characters and a physical exodus portrayed. After all, a better day was coming. 80 years later, though, in Nomad, it's hard to see that it has. But for the nomads, the road goes on. This has been Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. Catch up with us at Take2MovieReview.com and feed us back on our channel on YouTube.
Hi, and welcome to COVID Quickly, a new Scientific American podcast series.
This is your Fast Track update on the COVID pandemic. We bring you up to speed on the science behind the most urgent questions about the virus and the disease. We demystify the research, and we help you understand what it really means.
I'm Tanya Lewis.
And I'm Josh Fishman.
And we're Scientific American's senior health editors. Today, after a whole awful year of COVID, we're going to talk about what we did wrong and what we've learned to do right.
We'll also be correcting an idea that the new Johnson & Johnson vaccine is second-rate.
And giving you news about some recent developments in COVID medicines.
This is not a celebration kind of anniversary, but we're at the 1-year milestone of the pandemic.
This week is the 1-year anniversary of when the World Health Organization first called COVID a pandemic. This time last year, the world was going into lockdowns, borders were closing, and cities became ghost towns. Now we've lost more than 2.6 million people worldwide to this awful disease, including more than 500,000 in the U.S. alone. I wrote a story about some of the biggest mistakes in the U.S. pandemic response, from not taking the virus seriously, to confusing or inaccurate mask guidance, to failing to protect our most vulnerable people, whether it's the elderly, essential workers, or people of color. These mistakes cost us hundreds of thousands of lives.
It's been such a tragedy. Has it only been disaster after disaster?
Well, there were some successes too. Healthcare workers really stepped up to help treat people the best they could. Everyday people took the initiative to help flatten the curve by staying home and wearing masks. And perhaps most impressive of all, several highly effective vaccines were developed in record time, and they all protect against severe disease and death. And now millions of Americans are getting vaccinated every day across the country. In fact, we're already seeing dramatic declines in the numbers of elderly people who are hospitalized and dying from COVID in the U.S., which is at least in part due to the vaccines. So I've been reporting on this topic of COVID now for a year and living through it like all of you. And I've learned a great deal about this virus and about how we respond to it. And I've tried to distill some of those lessons in a story about the pandemic, which is on scientificamerican.com if you want to read it. Speaking of vaccines, Josh, not everyone is totally excited about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. What's going on with that?
People are paying a lot of attention to one number from the vaccine trials, 23. Overall, the Moderna-Pfizer vaccines seem 23% more effective than the J&J one, which protects people at about 72%. So some people, like the mayor of Detroit last week, who at first passed on using J&J in his city, but then changed his mind, seem to think that J&J isn't as good. But here's why 23 is misleading. It's probably much smaller in real life. The first vaccines were tested early last year, when there wasn't a lot of virus around. The J&J vaccine was tested in late fall when there was a lot. A lot means, naturally, more people get sick. If Pfizer and Moderna were tested now, more people in those tests would get exposed, and the vaccine would show a smaller improvement than 23. Plus, we know J&J works against some of the new virus variants because it was tested after they appeared. And J&J prevented 100% of hospitalizations and deaths and 85% of severe illness. And that's what you want in a vaccine in the middle of a deadly pandemic, to keep you from needing an ambulance ride to the ICU.
What about drugs to treat you if you already have the disease? That's a different story, right? And sometimes a pretty frustrating one.
Yep. There are not a lot of approved drug options for COVID. It's been a year, and we've got the drug remdesivir and 2 forms of monoclonal antibodies that slow down the virus in your body. They work a bit, but the effects are not major. And there's the steroid dexamethasone, and that helps hospitalize patients who need oxygen or are on ventilators.
Well, that's disappointing. But do you know of anything new in the works?
Well, an NIH treatment panel recently approved another monoclonal antibody drug, tocilizumab, for hospitalized patients who are having real trouble breathing. The drug damps down inflammation. That's what's behind the breathing distress. But I talked with Lindsay Baden, an infectious disease doctor at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, who said that the drug only works on patients who also get dexamethasone. So you still need both. And he sounded a bit frustrated that there was not a clearer benefit to the drug. Other researchers share this frustration. Some of them are calling on the Biden administration to start supporting medicine development the same way it supports vaccines. Biden did just sign an executive order telling the federal government to come up with a plan to test more medicines. That seems like a step in the right direction.
You are now up to speed. Thanks for joining us.
Come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of COVID Quickly, and check out SciAm.com for updated and in-depth COVID news.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, and since you're listening to netrootsradio.com, show your progressive side and go to the donate button on the bottom of the homepage. It's progressives like you who power Netroots Radio and keep the progressive message beaming everywhere 24 hours a day. Just go to our donate button at the bottom of netrootsradio.com. Thank you for keeping progressive radio at full power.
Voter fraud myth fuels GOP drive to rewrite laws. I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. And that was a recent New York Times headline for the story widely reported. The Republicans countrywide are mounting extraordinary efforts to legislate voter suppression. Last November, there was record voter turnout across the United States and no fraud. Nevertheless, state legislatures across the country are pushing to enact laws that will make it much more difficult to vote by eliminating no-excuse absentee ballots and otherwise constructing numerous other obstacles to absentee voting, by minimizing early voting days and reducing the number of hours polls are open on Election Day, creating long lines, and effectively eliminating voting places in neighborhoods of color, and by closing popular voting places like college campuses and voting centers, and by ending automatic voter registration at motor vehicle offices, and by curtailing early voting on Sundays when many African Americans vote after church. The racism is palpable. The justification for this overt voter suppression is the big lie that the 2020 election somehow was stolen from Donald Trump, the remedy for which is to ensure that certain people, particularly people of color and other marginalized communities, don't vote again. The consequences of a successful legislative push for voter suppression would be dire. As a Democratic state senator in Iowa summarized, on this path, we're not going to have a working democracy. The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU because freedom can't protect itself.
In February, Texas Senator Ted Cruz ran off to a luxury resort in sunny Cancun, Mexico, during the deep freeze that devastated millions of his constituents. But I wasn't mad that Ted fled. What upset me was that our government let him back into our country. Cruz is, after all, the two-legged, self-aggrandizing ego that arrogantly and illegally tried to cancel the ballots of millions of voters in last year's presidential election. Then he helped dupe a crowd of Trumpeteers into storming our nation's capital in a violent and silly attempt to seize control of our government by force. Now, the wannabe autocrat is demanding that the Supreme Court suppress the people's democratic will. He's teamed up with the sour old corporate plutocrat, Mitch McConnell, to back a ploy by Arizona Republicans to disenfranchise Latino, Indigenous American, and black voters. Cruz and McConnell demand that the court's partisan Republican justices gut America's landmark Voting Rights Act, which prohibits states from restricting the opportunity for minority voters to participate in the political process. Arizona's Republican lawmakers had passed a nasty provision declaring that any ballot cast in the wrong precinct, no matter how valid, must be tossed in the trash, rather than merely allocating it to the voter's correct precinct. This almost entirely affects people of color, for GOP election officials play nefarious games with them, such as frequently moving their voting places, often at the last minute, with little notice. Instead of pushing their party to try winning these people's votes, Ted and Mitch simply want to eliminate the voters. They've asked the court to nullify that bothersome Voting Rights Act so their party can freely lock out minority voters. This is Jim Hightower saying the greatest threat to our democracy is not a violent mob, but a legalistic coup by thugs like Ted Cruz.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 2012. That was the day OSHA released its memorandum titled Employer Safety Incentive and Disincentive Practices. It addressed compliance officers and whistleblower investigators. It touched on employer practices that discourage the reporting of injuries and illnesses on the job. The memorandum stated that employee reporting is a protected right. It also asserted that employer discouragement could constitute a violation of whistleblower statutes like 11C of the OSHA Act and record-keeping regulations. OSHA emphasized that the likelihood of discouragement and discrimination increases when safety programs are linked to lower reported injuries and illnesses. The memorandum outlines 4 common scenarios. 1. When an employer disciplined workers workers injured on the job, employees must have a way to report injuries and illnesses. 2, when an employer disciplines workers for the time or manner in which they report an injury. 3, when a worker is disciplined for an injury as a result of violating a safety rule. OSHA asks, does the employer monitor the workplace regularly for safety compliance? Does the employer met out discipline equally regardless of injury? And finally, the memorandum stresses the need to examine the kind of safety program implemented. Does the program provide incentives to dissuade workers from reporting injuries and illnesses? Are prizes and bonuses awarded when reported injuries decrease? Discouraging and disciplining workers for reporting could be considered unlawfully discriminatory. It also violates the employer's obligation to document injuries and illnesses. OSHA notes there are positive ways to implement safety practices. Examples include rewarding workers who identify hazards, participate in investigations, and offer suggestions on how to make the job safer or complete safety training.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Blue Moon Spirits Fridays, because we are all Nighthawks in the Diner of Life. We always begin, whether from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River, in the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 30 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting to be a bit warmer than yesterday. Yes, indeed, we should be in the low to mid-60s. I'm sorry for admitting that, but it's okay. Partly cloudy skies, and we'll be having winds light and variable throughout the day. Now, clear skies tonight, and our nights are going to be pretty damn cold, in the low 30s, and winds will be light and variable. Now, tomorrow, Saturday, we're expecting to have a high in the mid to upper 60s, my God, though the lows will be in the mid to upper 30s over the weekend, and it looks like we should have pretty much mid to upper 60s degree weather for Saturday and Sunday, and then late Sunday night, we are expecting to, and because the nights are going to be fairly cold, once again, looks like we might have a mix of snow and rain on Sunday and Monday. We'll see how that goes. Confirmed cases of coronavirus have now spiked once again and now stand at 8,709. That's an increase of almost 30, and I don't think that is an update from last weekend, unfortunately. And our deceased have increased to 120. Pollen is still rated as none right outside the window here in Rogue River proper. The air quality index for the region is good at 26 parts per million, which just means that people are going to burn their trash now because they do that here. Ick. And the daytime UV index remains moderate, though it has ticked up one notch to 4. Barometric pressure is holding steady at 30.32 inches. Oh, I failed to mention we do have foggy conditions, and visibility is down to a half mile, and relative humidity is at 99%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that are crowdsources from around the world. London is 51 and partly cloudy. Paris is 50 degrees with a heavy rain shower and a flood watch, so take care. Rome is 58 and mostly cloudy. Kyiv is 28 with snow. Kabul is 50 degrees and cloudy. Hong Kong is 68 and partly cloudy. Tokyo is 54 and cloudy. Sydney, Australia is 72 degrees and clear. San Francisco, California is a crisp 45 degrees and sunny. And New York is 60 degrees Fahrenheit and mostly cloudy. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that are crowdsources from around the world. First, amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Blue Moon Spirits Fridays comes to us from Reuters by Media Coulibaly and Angie Aboa. The Ivory Coast faced shock and uncertainty yesterday, Thursday, following the death of Prime Minister Hamed Bakayoko, the West African nation's second premier to die in office in less than 8 months. A close ally of President Alassane Ouattara, Bakayoko, who died of cancer a few days after his 56th birthday, was appointed prime minister in July of 2020 after the death of his predecessor, Ahmad Gon Coulibaly, Ouattara's hand-picked successor. Although Ouattara named his chief of staff, Patrick Achi, as interim prime minister on Monday, while Bakayoko was in hospital, Bakayoko's passing leaves a vacuum for Ouattara to fill as he continues his search for a potential successor. It will be difficult to replace him because of his standing, his way of doing things, Abidjan resident Maturin Bamouni said, but even when they are not from his political side, he still managed to sort things out. A central figure in Ivorian politics over the past 2 decades, as the country was plunged into a prolonged conflict and a partition, Bakayoko, a jovial character with roots in media and showbiz, emerged as a conciliatory figure able to talk to all sides of the conflict. Bakayoko meant everything for Ivorians, a minister who listened to the whole population, even the opposition, another resident told Reuters. His capacity to gain the trust of all sides, including former rebel soldiers who staged a series of mutinies in 2017, threatening a fragile peace in the world's top cocoa-producing nation, saw him appointed as defense minister in 2017 and kept the portfolio when he became prime minister. He ended the mutinies and carried out reforms that helped keep soldiers away from the political scene during the October 2020 presidential election, said Abidjan-based historian and military analyst Arthur Banga. He succeeded in building trust between the soldiers, the chain of command, and the regime, which contributed a lot to the stability observed from 2017 until now.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Maria Carolina Marcello and Anthony Bodel of Reuters brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Brazil's lower house of Congress approved the basic text of a bill that revives a federal cash transfer program to help millions of poor families whose incomes have been hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. The chamber cast 366 to 127 votes for the constitutional amendment in a second of 2 rounds of voting, more than in the first round when it was approved by 341 votes. Brazil's Senate passed the amendment last week. The The aid package will not be subject to the government's usual fiscal rules, but the bill includes countermeasures delivering fiscal savings in the coming years to mitigate the impact on fragile public finances. The government's emergency aid to millions of poor families last year totaled some 322 billion riyals, worth around 4.5% of GDP. It ensured the economy's 4.1% slump last year was nowhere near as bad as many had originally feared. And $1 equals 5.5311 riyals. And that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day and the week. But you do know Netroots Radio will broadcast on. And we're going to meet up on Monday for River City Ash Mondays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day, all night, and all weekend for all the breaking news as it breaks, as we've been doing for the last 10 years, 24/7, 365. And we'll meet up here on Monday, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Robe à fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair, t'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum.